Hey, my name is Gabby, welcome back to my channel, and today we're going to be doing my October wrap-up. In the month of October, I was able to read 20 books, and you know how September was like my month of like 5-star reads? Well, unfortunately, it seems like October was my month of like 2 and 3-star reads. I mean, I was able to read a lot in October, but it wasn't the best reading month quality-wise. I did have 2 DNFs that I could think of, and to be honest, I probably had even more DNFs that I forgot about, but I did end up DNFing The Final Scene. This is a thriller that I got about 60 pages into, but I just wasn't really connecting with the writing in this at all. I just thought the writing was kind of like simplistic and basic, but in a way that I just like really couldn't connect with it or the characters at all. And then also, sadly, I did end up DNFing the new Eric LaRocca. I got about 58 pages into this one before I decided to DNF. This one's actually the ARC copy that's going on sale in January. I ended up DNFing this one for a number of reasons, but the main one is because some of the content in this book was making me uncomfortable in the way that like I just don't really like to read about this in my horror personally. I did work on a number of reading vlogs this month, including a reading vlog where I read your horror recommendations, which is a vlog that I do every single October and I have a lot of fun with it. I also did a really fun kind of like October spooky themed vlog where I read 2 horror books completely in the dark. I also did another round of like the spending a cozy fall day with me where I did read another book in that video. And then if you missed it, also I had my Chicago vlog this month because I was able to go to Chicago for the very first time this month and it was a really fun and great experience to go to Chicago. If you missed it over my Patreon, I was working on 2 different exclusive videos for the month of October. One of them was like tier ranking every single horror movie that I've ever seen. And then I also did end up posting another monthly vlog onto my Patreon in October as well. For the most part, this monthly vlog was like a really fun time. You know, like there was a lot of exciting life moments happening, especially towards the end of September. And then unfortunately, at the very beginning of October, we ended up losing Tank and it was like one of the hardest things that I've ever fucking gone through. October's actually been like a really difficult month. Like yes, it was amazing to get the experience to go to Chicago and like to be able to do that and just kind of get a break from our reality here now. But to be honest, October has been a really difficult month because we lost Tank. I'm not going to be talking about it on YouTube, to be honest, because talking about it is just so hard for me still. I'm going to have the Instagram link down below though where I kind of talked about what happened on my Instagram if you want to know more about what ended up happening with Tank, but it was really sad and it was really tragic. And I think reading has been the perfect escape for me in the month of October, if I'm being honest. Like I don't know how I would have gone through this month if it wasn't for the books that I was reading, but then also the Vampire Diaries. Like the Vampire Diaries has been like the perfect distraction for me this month. But anyway, that is not what this video is about. Let's talk about the 20 books that I read in the month of October. I am going to be going in order of like least favorite all the way up to favorite. So starting with the lowest rated book that I had this month is going to be Haunt Sweet Home, which I ended up giving this 1.5 stars. I really did not like this horror novella, which is very unfortunate because I was highly anticipating this book. And in this story, we're following this girl who's going to be working as like a production assistant on her cousin's show, and the show is like a reality show where it's called Haunt Sweet Home. It's kind of like home renovation, but there's like a spooky little twist on it. I did not like this book. I personally found this book to be like a complete waste of time. I feel like the writing was just so boring and monotone and I didn't connect with any of the characters in this, but then also like it just wasn't that interesting. Like there was nothing interesting happening in the storyline. Any of the spooky vibes in this book just completely fell flat and they were honestly like so cheesy. Another book that I sadly had to give a low rating to is So Thirsty by Rachel Harrison, which I'm so bummed about this because every single October I always pick up the new Rachel Harrison books, even though for the most part I end up finding them to be like just okay. But there's something about the way that she writes horror books that I find to be very fun, and this is one that I was especially excited to jump into because this one is like vampire horror, you know, and I'm kind of like in my vampire era right now if you hadn't heard. But this book, as far as like vampire fiction goes, this book literally reads like every other vampire book that you've ever read in your life. Like it literally brings nothing new to the table. I also found the characters in this book to be so frustrating because the main story that we're following in this book is between this woman and her best friend. And her best friend is like one of those people who just continuously tries to put her into dangerous situations because like she needs to like start living her life and stop being so boring all the time. And like I just hate that like peer pressure kind of like mentality from friends when these are like full-grown adults. I just didn't like the characters in this book. The main character drove me nuts because she was such a pushover. Like she just let everybody in her life walk all over her. And all of the vampire stuff in this book was just so boring. It's like, trust me, you've read it before. I just ended up giving this one 2 stars. It wasn't really for me. Another 2-star that I had this month that I'm so upset about is Guillotine by Delilah S. Dawson. Because I was such a big fan of Bloom by this author, I really thought that this one was going to work for me, and especially because at the start of this book, I was absolutely loving it. This one is a horror novella. We're following this young girl who like works in the fashion industry, and she really wants to like make a name for herself, you know? So she starts dating this guy, Patrick, who like she could not give 2 fucks about this man. She is literally using him because because she wants to get close to his mother, who is a really big person in the fashion world. And then he has this big like family thing happening on his family's private island that he invites her to. I'm so upset because at the beginning of this book, I was actually really liking it and I was thinking, oh, maybe this is going to be a new favorite. I was liking the vibes. It was having that like eat the rich energy and like good for her energy. I've seen a lot of people compare this book to Ready or Not, which I do see the comparison, but in my opinion, this book is like a wannabe, watered down, it wishes it was nearly as cool as Ready or Not, because I think something that this book was lacking was any like suspense. You know, I feel like the last 100 pages of this book, like things definitely get unhinged and they definitely get like action-packed and gory, but like I just didn't care about any of it. It's like all of the suspense of the story was gone. I also feel like this guy, you know, like he does have a lot of like family history and a lot of drama within his family that could have been interesting if we had been following the perspective of like any other character in the book. Like I just don't understand telling this story from the perspective of like this guy's random girlfriend. I also ended up reading Sleep Tight this month. This is one that I listened to entirely on audio, and this is one that I was really looking forward to because I thought the premise sounded so cool. But the thing about this book is that it markets itself as a horror book, and in my mind this book read a lot more like a police procedural detective point of view mystery thriller. But then I feel like in the second half of this book, this author tried to cram like so many horror tropes into the second half of this book that it was just like too much. I think this author was just trying to do way too much. I think some of the choices of the things that were happening in the plot in the second half of this book, I was like, really? Like that's what we're going with? I don't know, I just could not get on board with this one either. Sadly, I gave this book 2 stars. And then I also read Brat. This is one that I listened to entirely on audio, and this is one that I was really hoping that I would love because I saw a lot of people saying that this is like that kind of weird horror that involves a lot of like body horror. The main thing in this story is that we're following this main character who has just recently lost his dad, you know, so like this character is dealing with a lot of grief in this book. And you know, grief horror is typically something that I really love. I also do usually love like body horror books, and a lot of this book is about how he's dealing with the grief of his dad, and then there's also scenes where he's like his skin just starts peeling off. Body horror in this book was pretty, you know, effective. I was like grossed out. It was very disturbing and written in a way that like definitely had an effect on me. But I ended up giving this one 2 stars, and it was mostly because I just felt like so disconnected from this story, and I also just didn't really vibe with the writing style. Like I don't know how to explain it. There was just something about the writing that was very off-putting to me, but in a way that I just found it very hard to get invested in the story and what was going on. I just wanted so much more from this. And the next book that I read this month was Final Cut by Charles Burns, and this one is a graphic novel. This one has a lot of really like beautiful, colorful imagery throughout it, but sadly, this is another one that I ended up giving 2 stars, which is unfortunate because I have read a book from this author before. He was the author of Black Hole. This graphic novel was just really not for me. I honestly should have just DNF'd this like halfway through because I was getting a vibe that I was like, yeah, I am not the audience for this book, but I decided to finish it anyways just to see if the story improved. I don't know, dude, this is just not for me. I genuinely feel like this book is like a dude writing a horror book that's like the target audience is for other dudes, because like the way that he sexualizes women in this book was just so icky to me, and I just couldn't get on board with it. Like I feel like this main character was one of those guys who like thinks that he's just so different and so weird and so artsy, and then he just really sexualizes his female friend who like clearly doesn't really want to be with him. Like she doesn't really feel that way towards him, and it just made me feel very icky the entire time that I was reading this book, so I ended up giving this 2 stars. It was definitely not for me. And then another book that I gave a slightly lower rating to, this one I gave 2.5 stars, is Whale Fall by Daniel Cross. I know, I'm sorry I'm being so negative, but I'm telling you, it was kind of a rough reading month. I was reading a lot of flops, okay? But this is one that I was intrigued by because this whole story is about this man who gets literally swallowed by a whale. I just couldn't connect with the writing for some reason. We're following this guy Jay who is dealing with the fact that his dad had like recently gotten a cancer diagnosis and he had to go back home to his family. You know, like he has a very complicated relationship with his family, and especially with his dad. He has a lot of like issues with his dad that never got resolved before his dad passed away, because his dad ends up like throwing himself off the side of a boat and stuff, and his body's like in the ocean. And so his whole thing is that he wants to go and recover his father's body from the ocean. Like that's the premise of the book. And then in doing so, he accidentally gets swallowed by a whale when he's like swimming next to some squid. I just wanted to feel more emotionally invested in this book than I did. I just didn't feel any emotional connection at all to these characters. And so for those reasons, it started to get very repetitive to me, because the amount of times he brings up his father and their trauma, and like there's tons of flashbacks constantly. I feel like the way this book was written, it was trying to go for a more like artsy kind of writing style, but for me, it just did not work at all. You know, as I mentioned in the vlog where I read this book, I genuinely feel like 70% of this book is this man talking about his problems with his dad and his daddy issues. 30% of the book is the action of him actually getting swallowed by the whale and dealing with the situation in the ocean, how scary that is. Like, I just wanted so much more from this story because I feel like this book lacked suspense. But you know, I am usually such a fan of grief horror that I really thought that I would still connect with this and love it, but there was just something about the writing where I just felt so emotionally disconnected, unfortunately. Another 2.5 stars that I'm so upset about is this one called Fang Fiction. This is a romance book that involves vampires. I mean, is this not the cutest title you've ever heard in your life? Fang Fiction. And you know what sucks is that in the first like 10% or 20% of this story, I genuinely thought that this was going to be a new 5-star favorite. Like, I was eating that shit up, loving it, because we're following this character named Tess, and she has a very dark past. You know, like, she is the survivor of an assault, and we do get a lot of that explored throughout this book as well, just so you know. She likes to spend her days reading her favorite vampire novels that are called Blood Feud. But what's really cool about this series in particular is that there's a lot of speculation online that the vampires that are written in this fictional book called Blood Feud, a lot of people think that the vampires are real and that they actually exist in the real world. Fascinating, right? It's so cool. And especially, like, I was so excited to read this, you know, because, like, as I just mentioned, I'm in my, like, vampire era right now, and I was just so excited to read something so fun and so different from anything that I've ever read before. But then the premise of this book is about how these vampires from Blood Feud, they get, like, stuck in Tessa's world, and, like, they need Tessa's help in order to get sent back to, like, their world. And I don't know, dude, it was like so weird. It was like there was a disconnect with me. Like, as soon as we hit about 10 or 20% of the way through the book, there was a complete disconnect with me where I just like stopped caring about everything that was happening. I didn't really feel the chemistry in the romance like at all. And this story was just so long. Like, why did this book need to be nearly 400 pages? A lot of the plot in the second half of this book just started to feel so repetitive and so drawn out. I also think that the tone of this book was kind of all over the place, you know, because I feel like at times the tone of this book felt very like kind of silly and ridiculous because of like these vampires and because of their situations where they were put in danger. It just felt kind of like silly to me. But then the tone of the book would like shift sometimes and it would get very serious because she would talk about like her trauma and like things that happened to her that are really awful and really dark to read about. And I just felt like the tone of this book was all over the place in a way that like I just didn't love it. I just wanted to love this so much more than I did. So unfortunately, it was only about 2.5 stars for me. And then another book that I read this month is A Sunny Place for Shady People by Mariana Enriquez. This is one that I was really looking forward to because this is a collection of short horror stories. I believe there's 12 stories in this collection, and I am a huge fan of this author after reading Our Share of Night last year. Like, that was literally in my top 10 favorite books that I read last year. And unfortunately, for me, I found this collection to be just okay. I ended up giving this 3 stars. I mean, as expected with any, you know, collection of short stories, there were some that really worked for me and then some that didn't. But I was surprised that for the most part, I just kind of felt like lukewarm about a lot of these. I feel like a lot of these ideas that she had were really cool and really interesting, but then they just ended up feeling so like underdeveloped, or like the story never really went anywhere. I think by far my favorite short story in this entire collection is the one called Different Colors Made of Tears. That one is the only one that I'm like still thinking about a few weeks after finishing this book. I mean, one positive thing that I can say about this collection for sure is that none of the stories felt like too similar to me. I do think that they were all very distinct ideas and they felt very different from each other. I think there was a lot of potential here with a lot of these stories, but I just didn't love the direction that most of them ended up going in, and I kept feeling unsatisfied. Like, I just wanted more from each one of them. I also ended up listening to The Haters by Robin Harding on audio. Every time I read her books, they always end up being around like 3 stars. But for some reason, I always gravitate towards reading her new books because there's something about her writing style that is just so easy to get into and it's so addicting. And this was just something that I needed this month. Like, I just really needed something that was like easy to get into and that was going to distract me, and this book definitely did those things. And in this story, we're following this author who she works like as a therapist in the school, and she has written this fictional book that has come out recently, but she's getting a lot of hate for it online, especially by this one person in particular. This woman named Ingrid keeps posting these reviews and like posting these comments towards her. It's almost become to the point where it's like online harassment, and she's like hating on her because she's saying like, oh, you're taking experiences from your high schoolers that like you counsel them, like you're their therapist in high school and you're taking their trauma and putting it into your books, even though there's no like clear evidence that this is what she's doing. But she has these people that are starting to hate her online, and we kind of follow her as this is starting to like consume her and become a big part of her life. I do tend to love books, you know, that follow authors and kind of talk about like the behind the scenes of working in the publishing industry and all that goes behind it. And I did really like this story. The story was very fast paced. It was, you know, like I said, easy to get into. It was very entertaining, but I always feel like I just want her books to get a little bit darker darker or like a little bit edgier or a little bit more shocking. I always just find them to be just okay. But this was another one that like, it was just 3 stars for me. It was fine. Then I also read The Hitchcock Hotel this month, which this is another book that sadly, I only ended up giving this one 3 stars. I'm really sad about this one though, because at the beginning of this story, I genuinely thought that this could be like a new favorite, or at the very least that I would give this like 4 or 5 stars. I was loving the vibes at the beginning of this book because the first chapter, like the opening prologue, is told from the perspective of a crow, which I just thought is so cool and like so on brand for like Hitchcock. I really thought that this book was going to appeal to me, especially because like I'm a big fan of movies, you know, and so I thought as a Hitchcock, you know, fan, I thought that this was really gonna like appeal to me specifically. I like that we're following this character named Alfred, and I like that he's like gotten this hotel and he invites like a lot of his friends from his past to come to this hotel. But then I feel like it quickly becomes one of those stories where it's just a lot of drama between friends, and I just found myself not caring about any of it. It's just a lot of this character like bringing up the past and bringing up the things that he went through in the past, and I just got really bored with it. Like, I don't know, I found the first like 50% of this book to be really slow and really boring, but then even after things started happening in the plot, I just didn't care as much as I was hoping to. And then another book that I gave 3 stars is going to be Intercepts by TJ Payne, and this is one that has a very unique premise because we're actually following this guy Joe who works at this facility that performs human experimentation, and basically what they're doing at this facility is they're trying to like strip these people of all of their senses, and it is very horrifying. And we are following this character Joe, who is like the head guy in charge at this facility, and then we also do follow from the point of view of his daughter Riley. I think part of the reason why this book didn't really work for me specifically is because I don't necessarily love in books where we're following a character who like works for the government and like works for like top secret CIA, FBI, the kind of character who is hiding a lot of like government secrets and like has to be so careful about what they say. Storylines like that like never really interest me at all. I don't know why, I find them to be so boring. It's like my brain immediately wants to shut off. Maybe that's more of a me thing for a reason why I didn't enjoy this one so much, because we are following this guy Joe who's like the head of this facility, you know, and he knows a lot of government secrets, and like the government is behind, you know, everything that's happening at this facility. Like they want to unlock hidden abilities in the human mind. Like that's why they're doing all of these experimentations in the first place. There were definitely like some creepy scenes with the daughter that I really enjoyed reading about, and I did like reading about the complicated relationship that Riley had with her father in this book. But I don't know, I feel like this is another one of those books where I could say like the last 100 pages or so is just non-stop action. Like there's a lot of things happening on the page, but I just didn't feel like I cared about anything that was going on. So sadly, this one was just a 3 star for me. And then I also read The Pumpkin Spice Cafe, which this is a romance audiobook that I listened to. I actually listened to this entire thing when I was on my way to Chicago on the airplane. This story is really cute because we're following this character who is going to this town called Dream Harbor, which honestly, this town in this book is like one of my favorite little cozy small towns I've ever read about. Like I really felt strong vibes of like this cozy small town in this book, and I also felt strong vibes that this story like takes place in the fall and has those kinds of vibes. Like it had great atmosphere, and she's gonna be inheriting this cafe called the Pumpkin Spice Cafe, and then the story is about her getting involved with one of the local guys in the town. I've seen this book getting criticized a lot because a lot of people are saying like, oh, this is just smut, or like there's just a lot of smut and not a lot of story, which I do think is kind of true. But I ended up giving this book 3 stars because I do agree that the second half of this book got a little bit annoying for me, just in terms of like the miscommunication that these characters were having with each other. It got to be a little bit repetitive and a little bit annoying for me. But I also do think like the romance in this book, like their chemistry was pretty good. You know, like I thought that they were cute. There was a few scenes where I was like, oh my god, like that's adorable. Like I really like them together. And so because I was able to like root for the romance in this book, I didn't find it to be too like cringy. Like I don't know. I thought it was pretty cute. I don't know. I had a good time. I ended up giving this one 3 stars. I also ended up reading William this month, and this is one of the books that I read completely in the dark. And this is one that I was really looking forward to because this one involves like an AI robot. And this is one that I also have mixed feelings about because I personally feel like I found it really difficult to connect with the characters in this book because there's like no backstory on these characters before we just jump like right into the story, like right into the action, which, you know, typically I can't appreciate when a story just like jumps right into it, but I feel like I needed a little bit of backstory on these characters in order to feel like I cared about them. So this is another book where I feel like there was a lot going on. I just didn't really care about anything that was going on. Then I feel like the last like 50 pages or so of this book were actually so good. Like there was a twist at the end of the story that I personally didn't see coming, and I was completely shocked by it. And then the last line of this book, I was like, oh my god, are you kidding me? Clearly this author had a vision. Clearly this author had a really great idea for this story. I just personally think that this could have worked better if it was like 100 pages shorter, which I know that's like a weird critique because the book is already pretty short. Okay, this book is only about 200 pages, but I still feel like for this book being so short, it still feels like there was a lot of filler and a lot of scenes that didn't feel necessary. I think if this had been cut down even more into like a horror novella, like a really shorter one, it could have worked so much better for me. And that's why I feel so torn on this, because I loved the ending. Like I loved the second half, like what was going on in this book was so much more fascinating. So I ended up giving this one 3 stars, even though it's a bummer because I could have seen this one being rated higher. Okay, and now finally getting on to some of my positive reviews for the month of October, because I did find some new favorites this month. One of those being Nothing But the Rain. This is one that I ended up giving around 4.5 stars. I mean, you know it's good when I start tabbing a library book, right? This one is a horror novella, as you can probably tell because it's only about 90 pages. And this one is absolutely fascinating because we're following these characters who live in this small town where the rain starts to take away your memories, which is like one of the coolest concepts that I've ever heard in my life. This definitely reminds me of a lot of my favorite things like The Memory Police. It reminds me a lot of Memento, like one of my favorite movies. It also definitely kind of reminded me a little bit of We Spread because the protagonist that we're following in this book is 63 years old and she's now retired. So it's kind of talking about her retirement and like how she kind of saw the rest of her life going. It's so interesting to follow a character who like lives in this town where the rain is like taking away their memories. I don't know, like there's different ways that she goes about trying to find a solution for what's going on in her town. It is just so fascinating, so interesting. The only reason why I didn't give it the full 5 stars is because the ending was so, I don't know, in my opinion, the ending was kind of abrupt and I was kind of like, wait, what? I don't know, I was a little bit confused by the ending, but I really think this is such a strong horror novella and it's so thought-provoking, which is like the number one thing that I love about this. I did end up having one reread this month actually, and I reread The Har by David Sodergren. I actually reread this because I was able to get the audiobook through my library, and if you recall, I actually did read this earlier this year during Summerween in July, and it ended up being like one of my top favorite horror books that I've ever read. But I did read this one entirely with my eyeballs when I first read it, and I wanted the opportunity to like listen to this on audio, so it was really cool that my library actually had the audiobook. And you know, the audiobook was fantastic, you know, because we're following this elderly woman who is living in Scotland, and her accent on the audiobook was everything. And this book just really hits me still, you know, like it's definitely one of my top favorite horror books that I've read this year. It was another easy 5-star read. I highly recommend The Har if you haven't read it, because this is one of those horror books that has such a huge emotional pull, even though it's also simultaneously one of the most graphic and gory and disturbing horror books that I've ever read. Like seriously, even listening to some of these like visuals, oh my god, it was so hard. Another 5-star that I'm so excited about because I wasn't sure how I was gonna feel about this one is Fragments of Horror by Junji Ito. I've read a lot of his stuff now, and this one is another one of his short story horror collections. This one is a manga, and this one in particular has 8 short stories in this collection, and I was such a huge fan of so many of them. Like I gave so many of these short stories 5 stars that it was actually ridiculous. Like I think this might be my new favorite short story collection from Junji Ito, but this one, oh my god, especially the short story Blackbird, like that one had some imagery that I will truly never get out of my head. Like it was so freaking creepy. It almost affected me in the same way that like PTSD Radio affected me. Like it kind of gave me like the similar feelings, and it was just so creepy. Such a perfect read for October. Like seriously, this is such a good one to read around spooky season. I also ended up giving To Be Devoured 5 stars. I really love this, which this is one that made me so happy because I had never even heard of this book before, and this one was recommended to me by you because I ended up reading this book in the like video where I read your horror book recommendations. And this book was so fascinating and weird and disgusting, which is exactly what I tend to love in horror books, because in this story we're following this protagonist. She starts to get this like obsession with wanting to eat the things that vultures eat, you know, so she's like trying to eat dead things. And you know, as you could expect from a premise like that, this book is absolutely disgusting at some parts. Like it is so grotesque and like over the top and like gory. Like there was a few scenes that I almost had to like skim and like pull my eyes away from a little bit because it got to be a little bit too much for me. But then I also just thought the writing in this book was so gorgeous. Like this book was so beautifully written. I just really connected with this. I feel like everything that this book was trying to do, it accomplished. And the writing in this in particular particular really reminded me of like Eric LaRocca. It had that same kind of like grotesque feeling to it, but you also feel so connected to like the story and what's going on. Another 5-star horror novella that I had this month was The Laws of the Skies, which I'm so excited that I decided to pick up this book during my like little short and spooky readathon that I had at the end of October. This one has always intrigued me ever since I found out about it, because I saw a lot of people comparing this to like Lord of the Flies and The Troop, because in this story we're following a class of 6-year-olds who are going on this camping trip into the woods. There's this one kid in this group who is just an absolute little piece of shit troublemaker who just wants to cause problems. This book is low-key written in a way that is so beautiful. I see on the back that it says that it's kind of like written in a fairy tale style, which I would 100% agree. Like, it is written in this way that is so beautiful. I've never really read anything like it. Like, the way that it's able to like break the fourth wall with you as the reader and really feel like it's pulling you into the story was really freaky. It's interesting that we're following so many different characters in this book, and mid-paragraph it would like change the perspective of the character that you're following, but it just did it in such a seamless way where you almost don't even notice. There are parts of this story that definitely like made my stomach like absolutely flip upside down with like, oh my god, that is awful, that is disgusting, like that is so vile. But then at the same time, like there were almost parts of this book that wanted to make me emotional, you know, because I'm like, oh my god, like these things are happening to 6-year-old children. Holy shit, like that is so awful and so sad to read about. I loved everything about this book. The ending of this book absolutely shocked me. I was like, what the actual fuck? And then the last book that I wanted to talk about for this month, that was another 5-star new all-time favorite of mine, was Incidents Around the House by Josh Mellerman, which you might know that this is actually my BookTube book club pick for the month of October. So like, holy shit, the fact that it was my favorite book that I read in the month of October is so exciting. You know, because for my book club, I kind of have this like long running joke that I tend to hate everything that I read for my own book club. But I feel like 2024 has been the year where I have really turned that around, because I've found so many new 5-star favorites from my own book club this year. And this one especially, I just loved this so much. It just really worked for me. In this story, we are following from the point of view of this young girl named Bella, who's got to be between like 5 to 7 years old. She is very young. There's like this monster essentially that's like living in her closet that calls itself Other Mommy. But this story feels so much deeper than that. Like, I don't know, Josh Mallerman has such a beautiful way with words where I really felt so connected to all the characters in this book. I feel like both the characters of her mom and her dad felt so real, and they felt like such fleshed out real human beings. I just really loved the way that this dad would like talk to his daughter. Like, I don't know, there was something about it that just really worked for me. Like, I thought it was beautiful. Like, there was a few moments in this book where I nearly cried, and then I definitely did cry at the very end of this book. This book just really emotionally impacted me in a way that I was not expecting. I also think the descriptions of this other mommy creature, like, holy shit, it was genuinely so scary. And there were some scenes in this book that I will truly never forget that I thought were so creepy and so well done. I really do think that if you loved the book Daphne by Josh Mallerman, I do think that you would love this one as well. So it was a 5-star for me. I know that this book is not going to work for everybody, and that's okay, but for me personally, it was a 5-star. I also personally loved the audiobook. I know a lot of people are probably going to say that they hate the audiobook because it literally sounds like a little girl on the audiobook. And if you missed the live show for this book, I will have it linked down below where we discuss this book in pretty great detail. That is going to be all from me. Thank you so much for watching this wrap up. As always, I do appreciate you. I would love to know if you read any of the books that I read this month. What did you think of them? I would also love to know how many books did you read in the month of October? What was the best book that you read in October? Let me know all of the things down below, and I will see you very soon with another video. Bye!